record on this computer. There we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our second event of this month. Today we have Martin. He's going to give a talk with us. A little bit about Martin. He is a graduate student at the University of Toronto St. George campus. He achieved his BA at McGill University and MA at the University of Toronto. Martin is interested in the relationship between normativity and consciousness, the possibility of an agent-neutral value, the relationship between the mind and the brain, and the cognitive neuroscience of moral judgments. Martin, is there anything else you would like to add to your introduction?
That sounds right.
Perfect. I'm just going to pin your video and you can go ahead and get started.
All right, so thank you for that introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me to this talk series. It's really a great privilege to be here. So okay, so I have a bit of a PowerPoint that I can share. Would you like to make me a co-host?
I will pass on the host powers to you.
Thank you. Okay, so can we see this PowerPoint here in Google Docs? And there we go. All right. All right, that's all good. You can see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So the title of my talk is The Perils of Naivety in Moral Epistemology, Ethical Intuitionism, and Cross-Cultural Disagreement. So today, I'll basically argue that because other cultural groups disagree with us in some of our moral intuitions, this undermines their justification by suggesting that they originate from an epistemically untrustworthy source, cultural evolution. That's sort of the gist of the argument. And yeah, going to just flesh that out a lot more throughout this talk. Okay, so first, I'll talk about an approach to moral epistemology, which is like the theory of moral knowledge that assigns a very important role for intuitions in justifying our fundamental or foundational moral beliefs. So this approach in moral epistemology is called ethical intuitionism. The intuitionist epistemology states that certain fundamental moral principles are self-evident. So a self-evident proposition in general is not justified by being inferred from other propositions. It's not justified through an argument or through evidence. Instead, it's said to, in a way, contain its own justification. So to be justified in believing a self-evident proposition, we need only sort of reflect on the proposition and, understand it, and then sort of directly understand or apprehend its truth. In other words, we have to have a strong intuition that it's true or something like that. Usually intuitionists, they'll posit a faculty of intuition through which we directly apprehend the truth of self-evident propositions. And sometimes an analogy to perception is made, where when we think about a certain proposition, like the mathematical proposition I have there as an example, A plus B equals B plus A, it just seems true, right? So we're directly apprehending its truth in having this seeming of its truth. However, the seeming is an intellectual seeming as opposed to a perceptual one. So that's where the analogy with perception kind of ends. Intellectual seemings provide a sort of support for the truth of a proposition, although this support can ultimately be defeated or counterweight by other evidence. And that's essentially what my talk is going to try to do today. I'm going to try to argue that even though we have these strong intuitions about certain moral principles, a certain kind of evidence about how those intuitions come about, how they arise, should defeat them or undercut their justification. So yeah, some examples of self-evident propositions, the one I already gave in arithmetic, and then the inductive principle that the future will resemble the past. That might be an intuitive truth. So some philosophers think that a number of moral propositions are self-evident, and these are thought of sometimes as like the axioms of ethics, from which all other sort of ethical knowledge is derived. So many prominent intuitionists intuit a number of specifically deontological duties or moral rules that have to be weighed and balanced against each other in cases where they conflict. So for instance, probably the most famous ethical intuitionist, W.D. Ross, thought that there were 7 basic moral duties or moral rules, such as the duty of non-maleficence, which states you ought not to harm anyone. Then there's a duty of justice, which has to do with the right distribution of harms and benefits. Other duties include the duty of fidelity, to keep promises, be honest. The duty of reparation, when you wrong someone, you have to make amends in some way. The duty of gratitude, if somebody does something to benefit you, you ought to sort of return the favor at some point in some way. The duty of beneficence, which is sort of the flip side of the duty of non-maleficence, which it states that you ought to just benefit other people, and the duty of self-improvement, which I think has to do with moral self-improvement primarily. So philosophers who agree with Ross that these deontological principles are self-evident, right, who have these strong intuitions that these principles are true and sort of can't be derived or argued for, or not that they can't, but they don't need to be, that the strong intuitions we have that they are true are enough to justify them. They often say that a virtue of this kind of ethical theory, which consists in these self-evident rules, is that it nicely explains common sense morality. It fits very well with our strongly considered moral judgments and ordinary moral reasoning. On the other hand, trying to derive common sense morality from an abstract, overarching super principle like the utilitarian principle or the categorical imperative seems very strange. Seems very strained. These principles are said to, the categorical imperative and the utilitarian principle are said to seem artificial, and they don't really gel with what we really think, And so these theories don't fit well with our common sense moral thinking, and sort of the attempt to make them, to derive all of our considered moral beliefs from them seems to be born of an obsession with theoretical parsimony and systematicity. Right, so Intuitionism and these sort of basic deontological duties seem to do a much better job of explaining our moral judgments and moral reasoning, common sense moral reasoning. So for example, when we're asked what is wrong with not returning a favor to someone, we don't think that it's wrong because it fails to maximize total happiness in the universe. We just think it's wrong to not return a favor. Like, that's it. That's the reason why that's wrong. Okay. However, some of these specific moral principles that the intuitionist method leads us to are disagreed upon by some non-Western cultures. So I'll argue that this disagreement defeats the justification from intuition that these principles are said to enjoy, or their self-evident status, because cross-cultural disagreement suggests that these intuitions arise from an untrustworthy process, so cultural evolution. If our contingent cultural evolution had taken a different path, our moral intuitions would be different. And so they're in some way, the process through which we got them is not directed at moral truth, it's directed at something else, or so I'll argue. But first, I have to describe exactly what kind of disagreement is at stake here. We're interested in fundamental moral disagreement between cultures, which is the sort of disagreement about morality that is not based on disagreement about non-moral facts. So to give an example of a non-fundamental disagreement, if another culture believed that it was obligatory to practice human sacrifice, this might be based on their religious belief that terrible consequences would follow if such actions were not taken. Like, I don't know, if there was going to be Armageddon due to a vengeful god if human sacrifice was not performed. So obviously we disagree with the idea that human sacrifice should be performed, but this is not a fundamental moral disagreement since it's explained by non-moral religious beliefs and stuff about the order of the cosmos and stuff like that, which have nothing to do with necessarily with morality. And fundamental moral disagreement is what's of interest to us, since intuitionists could argue that erroneous scientific or religious beliefs are what prevent certain other people from apprehending their self-evident moral principles, specifically Ross's, because those are, from what I see, sort of the ones that are most in vogue. So however, I'll show that there is fundamental moral disagreement, and so non-moral beliefs cannot explain why certain other cultures don't share our moral intuitions. Instead, it's likely that our intuitions are sort of culturally influenced. So first, I'm going to give two examples of fundamental moral disagreement, and suggest that our intuitions about the subject of this disagreement are sort of undermined by this disagreement. Their justification is undermined. So first, Ross's duty of non-maleficence. So this principle, remember, tells us that we ought not to harm anyone, and in particular, we ought not to harm anyone in respective of their relationship to us, their social standing, and even their species membership. So I think that this is a near universal feature of Western moral thought, as well as among many, many other cultures. However, many small-scale societies don't actually disapprove of violence toward outgroup members. And in one 1993 study, it was found that the vast majority of 90 such societies surveyed actually don't have sort of moral prohibitions against violence toward outgroup members. So these groups clearly don't extend the same moral considerability to people outside of their group. They don't have the same moral standing. And some scientists actually suggest that these kinds of moralities were very widespread before the development of large-scale societies, which then came with these sort of universalist religions and moralities where everyone was thought to have an equal moral standing, like everyone almost in the world, right? Another study actually found that there's this tribe, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it, I think it's the Hopi tribe, native to the areas around Arizona. They actually thought that it was permissible for children to catch birds and let them starve to death. So a Western researcher was surprised by this view and sought to understand, why they held it. Specifically, he sought an explanation for this view that appealed to their non-moral beliefs. So maybe they didn't think that birds felt pain or something like that, and that explains why they thought this kind of treatment of birds was okay. However, he couldn't find any such explanation, and he concluded that this tribe simply didn't think that the suffering of these animals was morally significant. They didn't think it was morally relevant at all. So another feature of sort of the principles that we find, or many people, many Western philosophers find self-evident or intuitive, is their impersonal structure. So most moral principles, intuitionists find self-evident, have this impersonal character. They say that we owe people in general certain kinds of treatment, and it is just in virtue of the fact that they are people that we have duties toward them. And specifically, it's often because they're rational creatures or have interests or well-being or something like that. It's because of these very generic features of people that we owe them certain kinds of treatments. However, and so our duties aren't mediated by a person's relationship to us or their social status or any other, highly personal idiosyncratic characteristics. But in many other cultures, there are relationship and role-specific duties. So we are said to owe certain people certain kinds of treatment because of their relationship or social standing. So people are divided up into various categories, child, woman, stranger, with different rules telling us how we ought to behave with each type of person. And as an example of this, in the ethics of some Chinese groups, moral duties are determined by the relationship you see in a particular person. Fathers and sons are said to owe each other affection. Rulers and subjects owe each other righteous conduct. Trust is owed to friends. Proper order between the old and the young. And there are also specific virtues that pertain to particular familial roles. So fathers are supposed to be righteous and protective, mothers loving and caring, the elder brother fraternal, the younger brother respectful, and the son is supposed to be filial. So just to bring out exactly where the disagreement is, W.D. Ross specifically says in his magnum opus that personal relationships do not determine any self-evident moral principles. So he says, and I quote, "They do not serve as the foundation of any basic moral duties," unquote. So instead, the duties from a parent or from a parent to a child and vice versa are supposed to be derived from the impersonal duties of gratitude, beneficence, and maybe others, but they're not in themselves sort of foundational. So finally, to my argument about how this disagreement sort of undermines these principles, their justification. This disagreement in our moral intuitions with other cultural groups suggests that the origins of some of our intuitions are epistemically untrustworthy. They're sort of unreliable based on how they come about. The fact that people in different cultures have different intuitions is evidence that our moral intuitions and theirs were shaped by a process that scientists call cultural evolution. And this suggests that they're in some sense cultural artifacts. And in general, the reason why this process is not trustworthy is that cultural evolution does not aim at truth. So when a belief is formed and influenced, when the formation of a belief is influenced by cultural evolution, the process that influences it does not aim at truth. It aims at the successful reproduction of norms and group selection. So what determines cultural evolution? What are the specific forces? So in evolutionary theory, we have natural selection. The particular forces in cultural evolution are said to be factors like how well the norm or the belief fits within our evolved psychology, how well the norm or belief fits psychologically with other norms that we already possess, whether a charismatic or prestigious person in the group believes or holds the norm, whether the majority of the population believes the norm, and whether these beliefs help one's group outcompete surrounding groups, as well as other sort of random factors. So none of these, you could say, forces of cultural evolution are reliable guides to moral truth. They each aim, you could say, at helping propagate a certain set of beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors into the next generation of individuals in a group. Therefore, knowing that some of our intuitions were formed through this unreliable process gives us reason to believe that our moral intuitions likely don't map onto the true moral beliefs, assuming that that's what we're after, the true sort of objective moral principles. So sometimes, though, beliefs that were heavily shaped by cultural evolution are not unjustified. Like, think about scientific beliefs, like beliefs about the origin of disease or something like that. So I think it's likely that cultural evolution shaped this way of thinking in many societies. So why are these beliefs, these scientific beliefs, not unjustified, even though they also resulted from cultural evolution? Well, in this case, cultural evolution propagated a reliable methodology and tools like the scientific method. So think about how in the scientific revolution in what was it, the 15th or 16th century, how that spread new ways of thinking, new methodologies, new tools all throughout the West. And I'm sure there were other similar revolutions all around the world, but yeah, just think about that particular case, which I just happen to know more about. So in that case, our scientific beliefs, even though they came from cultural evolution, are justified because cultural evolution here is propagating this reliable methodology, the scientific method, through which we're able to form justified beliefs. However, it doesn't seem like our moral intuitions result from any other cognitive process, right? It seems hard to say that there's any such reliable process in the background that's affecting our moral intuitions. They seem to arise, I don't know, in some independent way. One could perhaps argue that, in resisting my conclusion here about the lack of justification of our moral intuitions, one could perhaps argue that certain other cultures inculcate certain cognitive barriers to accurate intuition, like self-interest or bias. But I have a feeling that this would be kind of hard to maintain. And as a result, the conclusion of the argument is that belief in some moral propositions, like the principle of non-malificence, not to harm other people, must be justified not by intuition, but rather by argument. So they must be inferred from more basic propositions whose justification isn't defeated by this evidence about where they come from. And I think that this is entirely possible. So yeah, I'll talk more about that a little later on. But consider by analogy how we would respond if we discovered that many of our basic intuitions about mathematics, logic, metaphysics, epistemology were routinely denied by other cultures. So yeah, and imagine these cultures also did just as well as us in surviving, navigating the world, producing technology, or consider what would happen if aliens had completely different intuitions about all these topics. I think that the response we would have is that we would immediately start to doubt that these intuitions sort of reflected the underlying reality that these disciplines sort of strive to understand, and see them as cultural artifacts, or at least see that, or at least we think that there's a sort of deeper underlying truth that all of our intuitions are getting at, and neither is strictly speaking correct. Although if the intuitions are conflicting, then this won't be possible. So yeah, I like to ask, why should we treat our moral intuitions any differently? So, yep, forgot to go over the slide, but I hope my description of it was enough to get you on the same page. So yeah, we should distrust our moral intuitions when other cultures disagree about them, when we have no reason to believe that our intuitions were influenced by a more reliable process, like the scientific method or something like that. So finally, just some caveats about what I take to have established here. Nothing I've said suggests that there are no self-evident moral propositions, or that intuition is generally unreliable with respect to morality, or that common sense morality is false. There might be self-evident moral principles that all cultures agree on, and there might be ways to justify common sense morality based on these principles, as well as through other methodologies aside from intuition. My argument here has targeted just some of the specific principles that intuitionists produce using their methodology. And I'm also not casting doubt about the epistemic value of intuition. However, I think that we have good evidence that some of the very same subjective states that make it seem like a certain proposition is true can seriously mislead us. And so we have to guard against these epistemically bad influences over our intuition, like culture and cognitive bias. And one way to do that is to see which of our intuitions are held by different groups of people around the world. And that concludes my talk. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Martin. I'm gonna just stop the recording now.